excited to introduce our guest speaker today, although he needs little to no introduction, just for the few of you who may be new to Unity of Dallas. David Drumm has been here since the beginning of time. I know because I was right here with him when they opened the doors. David is a local attorney, and he's very, very active here at Unity of Dallas. Been board president, served on every activity, opened the doors, closed the doors, and been now licensed Unity teacher. You're not a chaplain, okay? And you're not in the Divine Sisters. Well, then, there you go. So he's filled almost every role, so please help me welcome David Drumm, and thank you, Autumn.
Good morning. Who knows what this is, and Regina Nobles is disqualified from answering. And Jim is disqualified too, by association. Yes. Well, close. Yeah, compass. I heard it back there. This is a compass. What do we use compasses for? That's more of a, well, that's a different kind of compass. I mean, okay, it's two meanings, okay. Drawing circles, I heard the answer here. So we're gonna talk for the next little bit about drawing circles. Now, you're going, what? I didn't sign up for trigonometry class, am I in the right place? Well, just bear with me here. My premise is that the metaphor of drawing a circle is one of the more powerful metaphors that we can use to think about what it means to live, to grow, to develop, and to transform. So this talk is really about living, growing, developing, and transforming, but I'm going to use the metaphor of the circle. So let's talk first about what a circle is. Circle has a center point, and it has a circumference, and the circumference is defined as the collection of points that are equidistant from the center. And so there's a lot of corollaries of that. One is that every point on the circumference has a unique location, and yet it has something in common with all the other points on the circumference because they're all measured by being equidistant from the center. And the philosopher Aristotle, that is responsible for a lot of the concepts we use in our ordinary thinking, whether we know it or not, he considered the circle the perfect form and motion around the circumference of the circle to be the perfect motion. Now let's think about that, why he thought that way. Because if you travel around the circumference of a circle, there is no beginning and there is no end. You can circle perpetually in that route. And your motion can be uniform and in the same direction at every instant. You don't have to zig and zag. You don't have to change directions. You don't have to reorient. You just keep following that path. And eventually, you get back to every place you've ever been. So that's a pretty unique kind of motion. And because that seems so pure and unique, Aristotle and thinkers after him until the time of Copernicus in the 16th century thought that the motions of the heavenly bodies, like the moon, the earth, and the planets, they had to be circles. Nothing else would make any sense, right? Well, it turned out they're ellipses. They're not exactly circles. And so Aristotle wasn't completely right about all of the implications of that, but I think he was right about the significance of the circle as a metaphor of explanation. And so my plan for this talk is I'm going to talk about how we can apply the concept of the circle to understanding life, biology, to understanding mind, psychology, to understanding society, sociology, and then I'm going to draw it together by looking at it from a spiritual perspective. I'm going to be guided by two of my mentors on this, Ralph Waldo Emerson and Eric Butterworth, that I always come back to. And if you want to know where I got the ideas for this talk, it's not going to be a book report, but this is Emerson and this is Butterworth. So let's talk about life, what it means to be a living being. By the way, because I'm using a visual metaphor today, I'm doing slides. I don't always do slides. And deep bow to Jen Markley for helping me with the graphics, because graphics are not my strong point. But you will see on this slide, we can think about what it means to be a living being as to being an organism inside a circle with what's outside the circle called the environment. And the thinkers who theorize about how life got started, just how did we get life out of a random collection of atoms bouncing off of each other? How is that even possible? Well, it turns out that there are these molecules called amino acids that have the ability to build proteins, and that if you link amino acids in a chain of a different kind, that'll preserve the information for building an organism. And if you want any kind of evidence that God is immanent in the world, I can't imagine. That is just an astounding thing to me, that chains of amino acids can build proteins, and they build all these different kind of living forms, from a redwood tree to an ant, based on what exactly kind of amino acids are linked in that chain. Just let that sink in. That is truly remarkable. And granted, all living beings are not circles in their shape. Some of them are, but nevertheless, they do have this boundary, this circumference, even if it's not a perfect circle. And what keeps the organism alive is the right balance of permeability on that boundary. If you're completely shut off from interaction with the environment as an organism, you're going to die. You're a closed system. You're not going to get any nutrients. If you're completely open to the environment, then you're going to lose your center of organization, and you're going to die that way too. So being alive as an organism depends on keeping this balance of being linked to the environment enough, but not too much. And so the theorists that talk about how life got formed, they said these amino acids could start assembling themselves, but unless they had a membrane around them, then it wouldn't get very far, because there's too much chaos in what's moving around outside. So there were these membranes called lipids that have this characteristic of being semi-permeable, and that's what lets in just enough data and matter from the outside, from the environment, so that the organism can organize itself. There's a reason we call them organisms, because they organize themselves. They organize themselves with material from the environment, but they're protected by this membrane. And so that's what makes life possible, is we've got this, we're drawing this circle between the organism and the environment. And the very first organisms, I think we're ready for the next, well, let's see, here we go. The very first organisms were called prokaryotes, and it's okay if you don't remember that term, but that's what it is officially. That describes like a cell of a bacteria, and the cell of the bacteria has the DNA, which is the code for assembling all these proteins. It's just floating around inside the cell. Eventually, eukaryotes arose that have a nucleus, and then they have a cell outside the nucleus. So now we got two circles. Now the organism has drawn a wider circle. And what does the wider circle let the organism do? It lets it metabolize with the structures outside the nucleus without destroying the growth of what's inside the nucleus. So again, pretty remarkable. So that's illustrated by this drawing here. We've got the nucleus has a circle around it, and then the cell has a circle around it, and then the cell is custom designed to be part of a particular organ. It's a liver cell or a brain cell or a muscle cell, and then those organs organize themselves to be an organism. Again, pretty remarkable, but all made possible by drawing a circle or, stretching it a little bit. It's not a perfect circle, but it has some of these characteristics of a circle. And the center of the circle, again, that's where the organization happens. That's where the organization comes from, is from the center. And the center is the source of self-organization, and it's the source of agency, the ability to actually influence the environment. We're going to talk about that more as we go on. But now that I've introduced that idea of the center as agency, you could even think of it as will, one of our 12 powers. In fact, it's a good time to talk about 12 powers because Deb's been presenting a wonderful series about the 12 powers, and this center is where they all flow out from. We have these 12 powers because we are centers of organization, and those powers are different ways we use our centers of organization. But as a center of organization, we have a nervous system that houses a mind, and so I'm going to move now from the physical to the mental. And so in the mental realm, for those who study child development, how children develop from the womb to kindergarten and then to adolescence, the child first has an oceanic awareness that they're just kind of floating around, and they don't really, the boundary between the organism and the environment is there, but the child isn't aware of it. It's not really aware of the boundary. It is the world for a while. And then the child learns that if it bites the blanket, it doesn't feel pain. If it bites its thumb, it feels pain. And so it says, oh, there's the thumb is me, the blanket is not me. And so it doesn't create the boundary, it just becomes conscious of the boundary. And so by becoming conscious of the boundary, you have what's the inner circle in this diagram, the body consciousness, the consciousness of being a body. The child eventually develops to a conscious of having a mind able to act on the body. How does this manifest? Well, one of the ways it most visibly manifest is potty training. When there's no control of the mind over the body just does what it wants to do. But the child learns to be able to control certain body functions with the mind, and to do that, it's now aware. I have a mind, and that's a little wider circle, and then I have a body that's inside the mind. And then the last stage illustrated in this diagram is self-consciousness, is actually being conscious that you have a mind, not just using a mind, but being able to look at your mind with your mind. And that last step is the gateway to spiritual realization and spiritual thinking, which we'll get to a little bit later. Just as organisms don't live without an environment, individual selves, people, persons, do not live except in a society of other persons. And so that gets me into my third realm, which is the social realm. And in the social realm, that ego identity, which is the identity of a separate self, it goes through those stages we just talked about, and it widens the circle of how it conceives of itself, of what it understands as itself. But what is outside of that circle is the other, the non-self. And that as long as there's an individual self, there's going to be a boundary. It's just a question of where is it, what is in that boundary, and what is outside of that boundary. So I think the next slide, if I'm in the right order, takes us through stages of social development. Before I get to what's on here, let me talk about one other aspect. So, should have talked about this one with the last slide, but in that relationship between the self and the society, the self has to learn how to take a role and to follow certain rules to exist harmoniously in that society. And this usually happens about kindergarten. That's really what kids learn in kindergarten, is they learn not to bite people, not to throw tantrums in the grocery store. You know, in fact, there's a book by a guy named Fulgham. Everything I know I learned in kindergarten. That's really what that's about. You know, kindergarten sort of teaches us how to be a socialized ego. You know, we're no longer just an unrestrained ego, we're a socialized ego. And back to my point about you want just the right amount of permeability, the psychologists that study disorders say that you can go off the center in two directions in developing that social ego. If you are too non-assertive and non-individual, you have what they call a borderline pathology, that you're influenced by everybody around you, you have no independent opinion. If you're around, if you've seen the Woody Allen movie Zelig, Zelig is about borderline personality disorders, that you've got no independence, you're just kind of flowing with the wind, and whatever people around you do, that's what you are. On the other hand, if you don't make that transition to socialize, then that's a narcissistic personality disorder. That's a personality disorder where it's all about my ego. It's not about fitting in with anybody. It's about the dominance of my ego. And but there's a further growth step from the socialized self, and this is one that those of you that have done the quantum living process have practiced with, which is when we create that socialized self, we select certain parts of ourselves that go with that role that we take in society, and we claim those, we own those. And then there are certain other things that are true about ourselves that may not fit those roles, and we disown those, we cast them out. And we call that the shadow. We call the part of our ego that we own the persona. This comes from Carl Jung. This is Jungian psychology. We call the part we own the persona, and the part we have but don't own, we call that the shadow. And the next step of drawing a wider circle is drawing a circle wide enough to include that shadow. You know, again, the shadow's there. This is all about consciousness. When I talk about in the mental realm, when I talk about drawing a wider circle, you know, I'm not talking about being a bigger organism physically. I'm talking about having an expanded sense of consciousness. And so when the shadow moves from unconscious to conscious, then we've drawn a bigger circle, and we have a bigger sense of self. The society itself, I think we're to the next slide now. Well, the transpersonal I'll get to here at the end, but the transpersonal is a further growth, but I'm going to put a pin in that for now. Okay, so another kind of circle we could talk about is, and I forget whose idea this is, but it's a great idea, that we have a circle of influence in our society that is narrower than our circle of concern. In other words, we're concerned about things that we have no influence over. And this is the heart of the serenity prayer. You know, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I can't change, to change the things I can. One of them's the circle of concern, one's the circle of influence. Most of us spend too much time out in the circle of concern, outside our circle of influence. We worry about things that might happen or things that we don't like, but we don't have any ability. I'll own this one. I've got 2 adult kids, and sometimes I wish my kids showed up a little different than they do. But, at the ages they are, I've really got no control over that. So I've got to say, well, that may be in my circle of concern, but it's not. I mean, maybe I can influence a little bit, but I definitely can't control. So it's not in the circle of influence. So the technique for psychological growth and psychological health is to direct the attention to what we can influence. And here's the magic thing there, is that when we do that, when we direct things to what we can influence, we push out, we widen. Again, this is all about drawing wider circles, but we draw a wider circle of concern because one thing we didn't talk about in circles is, in addition to the travel around the circumference, there's a travel out from the center of the circle that we call centrifugal force. And there's a direction from the circumference to the center that is centripetal force. And the centripetal force, if the energy is directed from the outside to the center, this is what happens in narcissism or any kind of excessive egotism. If we draw it from the in, we create a contracting movement. The energy is now contracting. And so what's that going to do? That's going to push the boundary of the circle. It's going to constrict it. It's going to make it smaller. If we put our energy in centrifugally directing our energy, then it's going to create a pressure that's going to cause that circle to expand. And let's go to the next slide there. That's backwards, I think. Okay, so this is a quote from, I mentioned Ralph Waldo Emerson. He wrote this essay called Circles in 1842. And his language, sounds a little dated, but it's 1841, I guess. Language is a little dated, but it speaks directly to what I'm talking about here. He says, "The life of man is a self-evolving circle which from a ring imperceptibly small rushes on all sides outwards to new and larger circles, and that without end. The extent to which this generation of circles, wheel without wheel, will go depends on the force or truth of the individual soul." So now we're to the spiritual part. Let's go to the next slide here that hopefully ties the rest of this together. That one I probably put in the wrong order. This shows how there's also circles in the way societies organize themselves. I won't spend much time on this, but early societies were all about kinship. Who are you related to by blood or marriage? And that was the only social tie that tied the society together. At a wider, and you could only get so large a society that way because you can only keep track. I don't know who my fifth and sixth cousins are. You can't track kinship out that far. But at a higher level of organization, societies are organized around ideology. What do you believe? And this made possible things like the Roman Empire. Not that the Roman Empire was the be-all and end-all, but it was able to organize a larger territory because it wasn't based on kinship. It was based on following Caesar as basically the representative of God on earth. And then a further turning of the wheel is toward democracies, the rule of law, mutual respect. Instead of following one leader, it's now, what are our ties to each other? How do we relate to each other as fellow citizens? Is this tie? And this is something I think we could focus on a little bit maybe. So about the centrifugal and the centripetal, Eric Butterworth, the other mentor I mentioned, he's got this book written in 1989 called The Concentric Perspective, and the subtitle is What's in It From Me? And that goes right to the heart of this distinction between the centrifugal and the centripetal force, is that there's a lot of tendency in our culture and in our biology that we should look at every issue as what's in it for me. In other words, transactional. That's the centripetal movement. That's the movement in. What Butterworth suggests is we turn that around, and instead of asking the question, what's in it for me, we ask, what's in it from me? What can I contribute to the situation? And that's what will create the energy that pushes out these circles, as I talked about. And this is a point that sometimes is misunderstood in New Thought, and Butterworth addresses it very well in this particular book, is that there is a reciprocity that as you give, so you will receive. And you could look at that transactionally. You could say, as I give, so that I receive, and so I'm going to give so that I can receive. But as Butterworth says, that defeats the whole purpose, because then your focus is now the centrifugal. You're now treating it as a means to an end instead of an expression of who you came here to be, as Gary Simmons likes to say. And there's a wonderful metaphor from the Kabbalah about the darkness and the light. Kabbalah is mystical Jewish teaching from the Middle Ages. And it is that if you think about light as a metaphor for love, which it usually is in spiritual teachings, that light, if it's allowed to flow out from the center, then it will be indiscriminate in who it benefits. It will benefit the giver and it will benefit the recipient. Whereas if you try to cover up the light and make darkness, there's no reciprocity. The darkness just dies. I mean, well, the other thing about light is it reflects, right? So if you think about giving of love to another human being as shining a light, then if I give love to another human being, they're giving of love back to me as a reflection of the light. And so that creates a circuit, and it increases. But if I think about what am I going to get, then I'm taking that light, I'm covering it up, and it's not reflecting anywhere. I mean, it's just covered up. Wonderful spiritual metaphor. This is a saying from Nicholas of Cusa, who lived in the Renaissance. And he said, God is a circle whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. Okay, so let's think about that one. So God has a center. That's the center of my being, the center of your being, the center of your being, the center of the person that we most despise and hate, the center of every living thing, and there's no limit to the circumference. There's no circle being drawn. So that's one circle. There's the God circle. Eric Butterworth calls that the allness. That's the allness of God. There's another circle, which is our personal circle. That's the eachness. Eric calls that the eachness of God. And if we draw a larger circle in all these different ways we're talking about, then we get more of the allness inside our eachness. And what does that mean? We have more of the experience of the presence of God. I mean, I've come to realize that that's what it's all about. Everything else that we do is because we want more experience of the presence of God. You know, we get it different ways. You know, we get it from this hobby we enjoy or this thing that gives us pleasure, but all of those are experiencing the pleasure of God. And so the wider circle we draw, the more God experience we have. And so why do we have individual circles? Why isn't there just the God circle? Why isn't there just this circle whose center is everywhere and circumference is nowhere? Well, this gets into why there's a created manifest world, but my belief is that there is a world because God enjoys the experience of us being a vessel and a vehicle for the consciousness of this presence, and that we actually enrich God's life by growing, developing, transcending, drawing these bigger circles. This is a diagram from this same book by Eric Butterworth, The Concentric Perspective. And so he says, imagine on the left you've got these intersecting lines, and on the left there's a coin that is being in capital letters. To the right, there's being me. So that's what I just talked about. The being, that's the circle whose center is everywhere, whose circumference is nowhere. The being me, that's how we've defined our own self-circle at a particular point in time. The point of connection is the perspective from which we're experiencing. And if we expand the circle around that perspective, then we get more of the being in the left-hand side into being me on the right-hand side. That's how we spiritually develop and spiritually grow. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I always like to bring it back to Jesus, because I think you can find all of these ideas if you read the authentic teachings of Jesus. And the two I'm going to talk about real briefly are from the Sermon on the Mount. They're both from Matthew chapter 5. This one is directly the same metaphor as the one I mentioned from the Kabbalah. It is about light. And Jesus says, "You're the light of the world. This should be set. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do men light a lamp and put it under a bushel, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven." So he's saying the same point. If you put your light under a bushel, then you're cutting off the circuit. You're trying to hoard the light. But if you give the light, then it's going to benefit everybody. So let's go to the next quote. Here's a corollary to giving love. So it's all, drawing a wider circle is all about being a giver and not a getter. That's what it's about. And what do we give? Primarily we give love. I mean, we can give other things. We can give money and things, but those are just ways to express love. I mean, we give money to people and institutions because we love them. And so we can love without giving money. We can love including giving money if we have it. The important thing is to give the love. And the corollary to giving is forgiving, because the inability to forgive restricts our ability to draw a wider circle. Why? Because that son of a bitch we can't forgive needs to stay out of the circle, needs to stay outside the circle. And I'll be damned if I'm going to draw a circle big enough to bring him in, right? I've been there. And so it's not a coincidence that giving and forgiving are almost the same word. So Jesus spoke directly to this. He said, "But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother shall be liable to the council, and whoever says, 'You fool,' shall be liable to the Gehenna of fire." Now, I intentionally use the word Gehenna here. You don't see this quote a lot in Unity talks because Gehenna is usually translated as hell, and Unity people don't like to talk about hell. But Gehenna is really the name for the fire outside the gates of Jerusalem where they burn the garbage. And so in this context, Gehenna isn't necessarily like the eternal flames, you know, that we experience after death if we're bad. It's a metaphor for painful purification. And it is painful when you try to hold on to not forgiving somebody. You know, it's, as somebody said, not forgiving someone is like drinking poison and hoping the other person will die, you know, because you're carrying it inside. So, you know, if you say, David, this is all too abstract, you know, what do you mean drawing a larger circle? What I mean about drawing a larger circle is giving love and forgiving. It's really that simple, and it's that hard. So we've adopted, yeah, that's it. So we've adopted evolutionary purpose statement as a statement of why we come together as community at Unity of Dallas, which is on a slide that appears at the beginning and is here. And we say we exist as a community and an institution to transform lives and inspire people to make a positive difference in the world. So both of those can be thought of as drawing larger circles. Transforming ourselves is drawing a larger circle about how we define ourselves. Making a positive difference in the world is drawing a wider circle about who is in community with us, is how we make a difference in the world. So I'm going to close with a very brief meditation experience to plant some of these ideas. And so let's just allow our minds to find that center we've been talking about and to dwell in that center. And just briefly, questions are seeds. And so we're going to plant some questions in that center, knowing that they will sprout and bear fruit and take root in their own due time. And so we don't need to answer these questions necessarily right here. We're really not allowing enough time for that. But let's plant these questions and just allow them to germinate. And they'll germinate when we're asleep and dreaming and when we're driving in the car and whenever they want to germinate. But question number one is, how porous is my body boundary with the environment in terms of nutrition and aerobics? Am I living a relationship with the environment that optimizes the health and organization of my organism? Second question, how am I defining the circle of my self-identity? Where does me stop and the other start? Third question, who am I allowing into the circle of others that I consider my brothers and sisters, fellow citizens, and persons I am in community with? And then the final question, in each case, how can I draw a wider circle, or how can I maximize the permeability of the boundary of that circle to where I am in the right balance of protection and openness with the outside of the circle? So we just allow these seeds to germinate in the silence, and in their own time, they will bear